Hello. In the next half an hour, I'd like to consider the special features of cyberbullying and how online modern communication systems have facilitated the rise in this form of bullying, and how people whom you would never associate with any kind of bullying get drawn in and become complicit in practicing it, often without realizing how they became involved. I put my slides online on the ABEL website alongside the video, complete with my notes, and I put a lot of references to documents that you can download to read further, so hopefully you won't need to take too many notes this afternoon. And cyberbullying is not that new. In 1999, on April the 20th, the 17-year-old Eric Harris and an 18-year-old Dylan Klebold walked into Columbine High School with a variety of weapons and started killing staff and students. 12 students and 1 teacher were killed and 24 people were injured, and then Eric and Dylan committed suicide. An investigation later showed that Harris and Klebold were subjected to constant bullying, which greatly contributed to their decision to enter their high school and open fire. Investigations also showed that school staff were well aware that these 2 young men were being regularly bullied, but their response had been, "Don't worry, man, it happens all the time." And in 2007, Megan Meyer, a Missouri 15-year-old who was very connected to the internet, became the target of personal attacks and insults, which drove her to commit suicide. She was fooled into forming a deep friendship on the internet with a non-existent boyfriend who'd been created in order to harm her by sending her cruel messages. She received a hurtful, bullying message on the internet, went up to her room and hanged herself. The perpetrator, a local man who had a grudge against Megan's family, was identified, but no criminal charges were ever brought. And now we have the terrible events of last week in Texas, where a young man called Salvador Ramos was being repeatedly bullied for his clothing and an impediment in his speech, and he bought 2 rifles and went to an elementary school and in all killed or wounded 37 people. These incidents all involve young people being bullied via the internet, and there is a false impression that this is a problem limited to young people. Research on cyberbullying of adults is quite limited, since most research into the topic has relied on interviewing university students on their experiences at school or college. However, in 2009, the AMWU, using a randomly selected survey of their members, discovered that over 34% of respondents had experienced some form of bullying, and 10.7% of those had also been cyberbullied. And everyone who had been bullied had also been cyberbullied. 10 years later, in 2019, the University of Christchurch, New Zealand conducted a survey of adult cyberbullying with a much larger research population of 20,000 respondents. Now, of those respondents, 15% reported they had been cyberbullied at least once in their lifetime, and 2% reported that they had been cyberbullied during the last month. Now, bullying of any kind is a deviant behaviour. Deviance is defined as any behaviour that the majority of a given group regards as unacceptable, or that typically evokes a collective response of a negative type. And the key things which make cyberbullying different from conventional physical or verbal abuse is the level of anonymity which the use of the internet tends to make possible, coupled with the user's ability to achieve a greater impact from their actions. Cyberbullying tends to create mob behaviours, inciting people to join in, and this tends to make the act of cyberbullying last a lot longer on the internet. And it also becomes a stimulus for mob behaviour. Now, this is referred to as the social learning theory because people learn and imitate the behaviours of others around them. Professor of Criminology Ronald Akers and Wesley Jennings examined this in the Handbook of Criminological Theory, published in 2016. And they suggest that people are generally more likely to engage in deviant or criminal behaviour when they associate with other people who promote and favour behaviour of this type and offer justifications for its use. So if deviant behaviour is either condoned or goes relatively unpunished, it is more likely to be imitated. Now, this is sometimes referred to as differential association because individuals see a particular behaviour as being effective or uncondemned, and the more someone is exposed to it, the more likely they are to adopt it. In other words, it's a cancer which can spread through an organisation unless it's treated very quickly, and one or two deviant individuals can quickly corrupt an entire organisation. And now I'd like to share with you an example of social learning theory in practice. An online PCC meeting was organised in a church, during which everyone joined on Zoom. An attempt was made to prevent the church warden from joining the meeting by not letting them out of the Zoom waiting room, because one vociferous individual objected to them being present. Now, that individual managed to delay the start of the meeting for almost 15 minutes, while an argument raged about whether to admit the warden, who was of course legally entitled to be there, and who had done nothing wrong, apart from to support the rector in a local dispute. While people clearly felt that this was an incorrect action, they were unable to prevail over one or possibly two loud individuals who were experienced at bullying. And amongst those present at that meeting were an engineer, a solicitor and a journalist. Otherwise highly respectable people entrusted with the running of a church. And yet they shrank from standing up to what was clearly the proper thing to do, until one person found the courage to speak up and the warden was admitted. Now, this is an excellent example of social learning theory, and it shows just how quickly it can undermine the integrity of an organisation. Professor Akers identified 4 factors influencing the social learning of deviant behaviours. And the first of these is differential social organisation. Now, these are the common characteristics of a group, and churches tend to have closely knit groups with many things in common. Age, socioeconomic grouping, cultural or educational backgrounds are all unifying factors. And I live in Europe, where expatriate groups tend to be very closely linked owing to their common language, which differs from that around them. There are a lot of jokes and comedies about groups of English expats on the Costa del somewhere, but in ministry this is visibly true in many places in Europe. Differential location within a social structure also has an impact, and this is the membership of groups and the status and role of that group within a wider community, and this can have a major impact on an individual's social learning. Membership of golf clubs, art groups, even church choirs or Bible study groups can facilitate social learning, and if a group operates behind complex membership rules or any degree of secrecy about membership, it can enhance the process of social learning very easily. And so this takes one on to a third factor: theoretical structural variables. And these are weaknesses and flaws within an organisation itself, which can promote deviant behaviour. If a group is already experiencing disorganisation or even internal conflicts, deviant behaviour can creep in and will quickly be adopted as a behavioural norm. And then finally, there is the issue of differential social location within the group itself. The size, organisation and power structures of the group, together with an individual's personal position within that group, can increase peer pressure. And this is especially true if the deviant behaviour is being driven from a senior or influential position. Fear of group rejection driven by the leadership can accelerate the social learning, and what starts out as a fearful compliance can quickly become natural behaviour because it goes unchallenged. So that in general terms is how deviant behaviour can be propagated. Now, what has the internet done to facilitate this? Well, I'm going to start with definitions around cyberbullying offered by Professor of Psychology Susan Limb, who has proposed 3 different behaviours, and those are cyberbullying, cyber harassment and cyber stalking. Now, cyberbullying is the most well known of these, and it generally refers to deliberate and hostile behaviour intended to harm people using the internet by leveraging the imbalance of power between bullies and victims. And cyberbullying tends to be viewed as repeated behaviour, although this is potentially a flawed approach since the impact is experienced by the target from the very first incidents, and cyberbullies may launch attacks at multiple targets. And that brings us on to cyber harassment, and these are defined as repeated or one-off malicious internet behaviours that are unsolicited but noticed by victims and which are intended to upset, disturb or threaten other people. And cyber stalking, which generally refers to a series of repeated intrusive behaviours performed via the internet, such as gathering private information or direct communication, and these are intended to convey implicit and explicit threats and thus induce fear in online victims. And these are both just highly refined versions of cyberbullying, so I will stick to that word for today. And supplementing this is Indian criminologist Dr. Karupanand Jaishankar's space transition theory, and Dr. Jaishankar's talk on TED about this is very interesting, and I do recommend it to you. The theory proposes that people with criminal inclinations will often suppress them in the physical world for fear of being caught. But on the internet, they can more easily conceal their identity. They can mix with a wider group of people, and there are lower risks of being caught. Also, the less connected that people are to wide social groupings, the more likely they are to commit deviant behaviour. And there you'll see the link to the video. Dr. Paul Lowery, who is a professor of IT at Virginia Tech and is one of the most prolific publishers of papers on online deviance, online harassment and computer ethics, has observed that the internet has enhanced the social learning model I've just described by adding the opportunity for anonymity. And this is overwhelming research evidence proves that people are more likely to adopt deviant behaviour online than offline. The internet allows abusers to benefit from diffuse responsibility, a distancing from their target and the ability to hide personal accountability within a crowd. And the internet gives the ability to carefully target an individual with a high degree of certainty that a bullying attack will be successfully completed by the computer, sadly owing to the efficiency of the system. And so, given that deviant behaviour is generally learned by individuals from others, there's also the concept of differential reinforcement, which is the effect of observing the positive and negative consequences for others who engage in deviant behaviour. And Professor Akers proposes that there are 4 reinforcement mechanisms which can encourage or discourage such behaviour. And these are positive reinforcement, which is being rewarded in some way for a behaviour, including rewards or benefits of a deviant behaviour. Negative reinforcement, which is the removal or lack of punishments. And then positive punishment, which is experiencing punishment. And negative punishment, which is the removal of rewards. If you couple that with what is expressed in criminology as a deterrence theory, this comprises specific deterrence, which is the experience of an individual being punished themselves, and general deterrence, which is the observed experience of others being punished for a particular deed. And this is linked to the rational crime theory, which is otherwise known as the economist's analysis to crime, in which the rewards of deviant behaviour are assessed against the possible costs. So, in order to combat deviant behaviour, we have to reduce the possible rewards while increasing the possible costs. Otherwise, the more that people observe deviant behaviour being successful, the more likely they are to initially imitate it. How many times have we heard about youngsters having their first experience with alcohol, drugs, or even shoplifting because they observe their peers acting in a specific way without negative consequences? And the internet can skew the balance here by increasing potential rewards while reducing possible costs. But what about people's inherent sense of right and wrong? Surely that should inhibit deviant behaviour. Well, these can be overcome by what is known as neutralisation techniques, in which a person accepts deviant behaviour as being all right under certain conditions. And the rationalisation process is that the circumstances are exceptional and therefore an act which would otherwise be morally unjustifiable feels justifiable. Now, everyone has social affiliations, the group of people with which one normally mixes, and these social affiliations tend to create behavioural norms. But in cyberbullying, these can be replaced by virtual affiliations, and any sense of anonymity or lack of negative punishment for deviant behaviour can contribute to disinhibition and also de-individualisation, as one joins in a group behaviour which exaggerates the individual's perception of reward. And anonymity is not just about a deviant not being identified. It's about that sense of diffuse responsibility, because if enough people commit a deviant act, no one individual can be selected for sanction or held accountable. And lack of proximity also plays into this, because no one else will see what a deviant is doing on their computer, because usually there's nobody nearby when they're engaging in cyberbullying. There's also a lack of knowledge of others. The deviant believes that no other person will witness what they do, and even if they did, they won't know them well enough to be able to respond to them. And then finally, there's the issue of confidence in the system. The deviant is confident there'll be no real-time monitoring or mechanisms to moderate their behaviour or bring them to the attention of a system administrator. Professor of cyber psychology John Sula has coined the phrase disinhibition categories to propose that people conduct themselves differently online to how they would in the real world. And he's compared benign disinhibition, where people are more open about sharing information about themselves and will undertake great acts of care and kindness for almost complete strangers. Just look at how GoFundMe has sprung up and how generous people can be to complete strangers, to toxic disinhibition, where people's online behaviour goes into darker places. And he's also proposed that the sense of anonymity can encourage people to behave badly. Now, this is disassociative anonymity. No one knows who I am, and even if they do, they can't reach back to me. There's also a sense of invisibility. Nobody can physically see me while I'm doing what I'm doing, so you can't see how I'm behaving or reacting when I'm behaving in a bad way. Asynchronicity. This is not occurring in real time. I send a malicious email, but it takes time to arrive, and this delay reduces any sense of consequence of a deviant act. It's a bit like ringing a doorbell and running away before the owner gets to the door, or throwing a stone over a wall and running away before it lands and breaks the greenhouse window. In solipsistic introjection, we take the things that we imagine in our head in imaginary conversations and we make them real. And we allow what's going on inside our heads, which should never leave that space, to get out into the real world. And you start to say the nasty things that you fantasized about saying. Disassociative imagination. People think that they can just walk away from what they do on the internet because it's not the real world, and there is no consequence in the real world for anything which someone does on the internet. The two worlds are completely segregated. And finally, there's the issue again of minimising authority, that no one will stop me, there's no sense of disapproval, and there's no risk of being liable to any kind of sanction. And in summary, we find that the human mind is capable of rationalising two major contrasts between the way they behave towards others online and in the real world, and an individual can adopt two entirely different personalities. The virtual world of the internet reduces a sense of guilt for bad behaviour, and the normal moral cognitive processes which we apply in deciding on our behaviours, which involve decision making, reasoning, emotion, and the heuristics, rationalisations and biases that influence our moral behaviour, can be distorted or even disabled when interacting on the internet. People can rationalise a separation between their online activities from their offline activities, and so avert any sense of responsibility for deviant behaviours. In effect, they lose their sense of moral cognitive processes. Anonymity also brings a sense of de-individualisation, which enables a person to lose their sense of self-awareness for their actions. It no longer is an action which is accountable to them. And Professor Qing Li has suggested that a computer-mediated communication system can start by fostering playful disinhibition, small, harmless exchanges and minor insults, But unless these are moderated, they can deteriorate as a person's sense of social accountability reduces over time. So what can we do to discourage and eliminate cyberbullying? Well, my proposal is that the church has to build from the ground up, creating layers of prevention reinforced by layers of deterrence. And the first area for focus is the creation and application of definitions, orientations, rationalizations, definitions of the situation, and other evaluative and moral attitudes that define the commission of an act as right or wrong, good or bad, desirable or undesirable, justified or unjustified. And these come in three categories: positive, negative, and neutralizing. Now, the positive definitions generate approval or acceptance of deviant behaviour. Negative ones represent disapproval, and neutral ones can result in behavioural justification, which then becomes temporary positive ones. Neutral definitions are the ones which are seen as permitting deviant behaviour under certain exceptional conditions. Therefore, deviants use neutralising techniques to characterise conditions as exceptional and to justify their behaviour to both themselves and to others. So the first thing to be done is to create and promote negative definitions of cyberbullying within our church for the good of society as a whole, as well as for our own worshipping communities. And I've referred in other research that I've published to the creation of a non-triangulation covenant in which faith communities publicly commit themselves to reject certain types of behaviour. And cyberbullying should certainly become a part of such a covenant. And this does have to come from the very top of the church and to be mirrored at every single level. We then need to reduce the sense of disinhibition by education, by making people using systems under our control understand there are very serious consequences in the real world for deviant behaviour online. And the next step is harder. The church is institutionally reluctant to punish, especially parishioners and people who are volunteers, and there is a myth that there is no ability to create sanctions against laity. But it's essential to apply differential reinforcement using positive and negative punishments with cyberbullies. Now, let's start with negative punishments, the removal of rewards. If the deviant is using any church resources for their cyberbullying, for example church-controlled email accounts or mailing lists, or even the church news bulletin, you must immediately withdraw their permission to use them. If they hold positions of responsibility or authority within the church, they must be immediately suspended from those positions. Now, this not only reduces the risk of repetition of cyberbullying, but it also serves to assure the targets that the risk of repetition is being mitigated. Now, whether or not there is a need for positive punishment will depend on the individual circumstances. But if one accepts that cyberbullying, or in fact any kind of bullying, is a safeguarding issue, then the Church of England already has well-defined risk management protocols which include suspension from office. And in the case of members of the Church who are subject to disciplinary or HR processes, these of course can and must be followed. Moving further up the hierarchy, the Church must address the twin issues of diffuse responsibility and social accountability. Because cyberbullying is frequently a group activity, it must be made clear that all members of a group of cyberbullies will all be expected to be held accountable for their actions. And similarly, even if perpetrators are not publicly identified, church authorities must make it clear to everyone that prompt remedial actions are being taken. And the word prompt here is all important. Cyberbullying can be a fast-spreading disease with any group, and if not halted quickly, it can quickly become an epidemic. Many people are drawn into participating in cyberbullying because of disinhibition, social learning, and neutralisation. Under other psychological and social conditions, they would not initiate such behaviours and would discontinue them if the negative stimuli were withdrawn. Now, cyberbullying is generally regarded as a cowardly act perpetrated by people who lack the courage to physically confront somebody or to have their actions witnessed by third parties. They fear the repercussions which might arise were they to be individually identified and associated with their actions. And the reliance on anonymisation and diffuse responsibility demonstrates that the perpetrator internally acknowledges that the use of cyberbullying methods are a deviant behaviour, or it might expose them to social, criminal or other sanction. So simply a commitment by an organisation to address cyberbullying seriously, to recognise it, to take technical measures to inhibit it, and to identify and sanction the perpetrators may change the balance in the rational crime theory and dissuade people from even participating in cyberbullying. But a church has to go further. In a company, you simply sack an employee or give them a warning, and you can prosecute in a really serious case. But a church has a role to maintain and a community to heal. So both perpetrators and victims require ministry, so there are extra steps to be taken. Cyberbullying is sinful. There is no argument with that statement. The Church must therefore address its involvement in the commission of the sin if its systems, offices or structures are being misused to perpetrate it. The Church of England has been widely criticised for its failure to adequately acknowledge and support the victims of wrongdoing and abuse, and given the deep physical harm that scientific research has repeatedly shown is done to people who are bullied, it's important that the Church of England not only takes this very seriously, but will be proactive and committed in addressing the sin. So firstly, there must be acknowledgement to the target and to the community that the sin has occurred. Prayer for the target may offer much comfort, as well as strengthening the community of faith values and a determination to oppose it. Then there must be repentance by the person who has sinned against the person targeted. There's an interesting theological issue here about how public any repentance should be. The answer suggested in Matthew 18:17 is that the repentance should be as wide as the knowledge of the original sin was, but no wider. And this is not the typical behaviour of the church. Having a quiet word or marking their card is the often adopted response to church managers. But how effective are they when, as I have witnessed, someone sent out a church newsletter to dozens of people containing encouragement to shun, send to Coventry, or in some other way totally ignore someone of whom they disapproved, and in that case the archdeacon with whom the matter was raised did nothing to retract or have an apology issued for the original act. They just had a word. There can therefore be no certainty of repentance in that position. And this brings us on to atonement and restitution. Firstly, there must be some positive or negative punishment. For a person in a position of trust or authority, they must consider, or have considered for them, their suitability to hold that position. For clergy, the CDM exists. For lay readers and lay worship leaders, webmasters, church wardens and lay or church officers, the position is not so clear. When someone holds a permission to officiate, the bishop can remove it summarily. For other church officers, if one holds that cyberbullying can constitute a safeguarding matter, then they can be suspended from that office or barred from office for a period of years. There may also need to be some sort of restitution to the people targeted, and this may only be restoring their reputation, but it could be anything. But then there needs to be healing processes, and first of all it's rehabilitation for the perpetrator, trying to reconcile the parties so life can go on as before, and trying to look at what went wrong, how it happened, and how the situation can be prevented from recurring. And now I want to leave you with one final thought. Anyone in authority within an organisation, including the church, must remember the principles of vicarious liability. If someone uses a church email or a website to bully someone, or does so while acting in performance of their office, for example a PCC member sending an email around a church mailing list, the church itself could be held legally vicariously liable if their role is seen as being akin to that of an employee. And churches with insurance may make much juicier targets for a nice lawsuit than an individual sitting in their own home sending nasty emails to someone. And the church, as an institution, has a moral as well as a legal duty to protect its membership from this evil, which can corrupt and corrode our faith community and disrupt the fulfilment of Christ's Great Commission. Thank you for joining me today.